Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into something pretty important in the climate discussion. Marine carbon dioxide removal. MCDR.
Yeah, it's definitely getting more attention. The IPCC, the big climate science body, they've made it pretty clear, haven't they? We can't just cut emissions. We actually need to pull CO2 out of the air, too, if we're serious about climate targets.
Exactly. And while maybe we're more familiar with stuff like planting trees, land-based carbon removal,
Yeah.
MCDR is, it's a newer player on the scene.
It is. And one specific MCDR idea is really taking off, or at least getting a lot of buzz. Ocean alkalinity enhancement, OAE.
OAE. Right. So what's the basic idea there?
Well, essentially it involves adding alkaline stuff, think minerals, or using electrochemical processes to seawater.
Okay.
And the point is to basically boost the ocean's natural ability to soak up CO2 from the atmosphere by making it slightly more alkaline.
Got it. So enhancing that natural carbon sink.
Precisely. And we're seeing, more research cash flowing into this, more studies popping up. And significantly, the US EPA just gave the green light, the first permit ever for an MCDR field trial right here in the US.
Wow. Okay. That really feels like a shift, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like moving this out of the purely theoretical realm and into, actual ocean testing.
It's a big step.
And that's exactly why we need this conversation, because as these technologies inch closer to reality, we absolutely have to understand the human side. It's not just about chemistry. How do actual communities, people living on the coasts, feel about this?
You've hit the nail on the head. Which brings us to the focus of our deep dive today. We're looking at a fascinating study from the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state.
Okay, why there specifically?
Well, several reasons. It's a key spot for OAE research, both now and potentially for future larger projects. They're already dealing with pretty bad ocean acidification there.
Right, the direct impact of too much CO2 in the water.
Exactly, which harms shellfish and other marine life. Plus, Washington state is, generally seen as quite climate progressive. There's active research that permitted trial we mentioned is linked there, and it's a region heavily reliant on natural resources, fishing, aquaculture, and crucially, it's home to several sovereign tribal nations who have deep connections and rights to the marine environment.
So a really complex and relevant place to ask these questions. Okay, so the mission today is
What?
to unpack how these communities view OAE.
Yeah, basically. To explore their perceptions and get a sense of how their feelings might change depending on how OAE could actually be done.
Yeah.
Different setups, who runs it, what tech is used, that kind of thing.
And the study used workshops, right? And some kind of future scenario planning.
That's right. Community workshops, getting people talking. And they use this interesting approach of presenting different hypothetical future scenarios for OAE deployment to see how people reacted.
Okay, let's get into it. After people got the basic rundown carbon removal, net zero, the two main OAE approaches, mineral and electrochemical, what were the sort of immediate gut reactions?
Well, it's interesting. Right away, their thoughts, the images that came to mind, they weren't just about the science. They were already jumping to the bigger picture, the potential ripple effects.
Like what sort of things? Worries? Hopes?
Both, actually. In one exercise, they talked about best and worst case scenarios. For the worst case, a really common theme was, simply put, that OAE just wouldn't work.
Okay, failure to deliver on the climate promise.
Exactly, or worse, that it wouldn't work and it would cause serious harm to marine life, to the ecosystems. That was a major fear.
The double whammy, ineffective and damaging. Makes sense. People would worry about that.
Absolutely. And linked to that was this concern that maybe focusing on OAE could be a distraction.
A distraction? How so?
Like, it could delay the really hard work of cutting emissions at the source, create a kind of false sense of security, like we've got this tech fix coming, so maybe we don't need to change our ways as much.
The moral hazard argument, basically.
Yeah.
An illusion of progress.
That captures it well, yeah. But then on the flip side, the best case scenarios, they were pretty much centered on OAE actually succeeding.
Right.
Succeeding in significantly mitigating climate change, maybe even actively improving ocean health, reducing that acidification. There was the sense of, hope that maybe OAE could be part of a real solution and even spur more climate action.
A potential catalyst for positive change.
Right. Now, issues like, who profits from this or how the benefits and harms are shared, those came up a bit initially, but they became much, much more prominent when people started digging into those specific future scenarios.
Okay, so let's move to that. The future scenario exercise. They looked at different hypothetical ways OAE could be rolled out. What really stood out then?
Well, first off, while ecological concerns were definitely still there, worries about impacts on fish, especially salmon, shellfish, stuff near the shore, even less charismatic species.
Right, not just the big famous ones.
Exactly. There was this broader feeling of just general unease about deliberately messing with complex ocean systems. Like, have we really thought this through? One person literally said they'd seen too many biological systems fall apart from interventions that seemed logical at the time.
That unintended consequences fear. That's a powerful one.
It really is. Beyond the direct ecology, though, energy use was huge. People asked, okay, how much energy does this take? Will it rely on fossil fuels? Because that kind of defeats the point, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Or even if it uses renewables, is that realistic? And could that renewable energy be better used elsewhere? Big questions about the energy footprint.
The whole life cycle impact, basically.
Totally. And then specifically for the mineral-based approach, mining came up.
Right.
And the reaction was pretty strongly negative.
Not surprising, perhaps. Mining often brings controversy.
Right. People linked it to environmental damage, social disruption in mining communities, impacts on their own sense of place if it happened nearby, or, just shifting the burden elsewhere. There was a clear desire to avoid getting locked into long-term reliance on mining if possible.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the other main type, the electrochemical approach? Any specific worries there?
Yes, the byproducts, particularly the potential for creating hydrochloric acid. People worried, quite naturally, about pollution risks. Is this just creating another problem?
Right. Trading one issue for another.
But there was also interest in maybe using those byproducts. The whole circular economy idea came up. Could the acid or other outputs be used for something else, like making cement, or maybe even helping grow seaweed, like sea lettuce?
Oh, interesting. Turning waste into a resource.
Yeah, that idea had some appeal. But even then, people were still a bit cautious, like, okay, what are the other unintended consequences of that,
Always looking a few steps ahead. Good.
And across all these discussions, this theme of social justice, of who benefits and who bears the burden, was just constant. A real concern that, as one person put it, less privileged people might end up dealing with the negative fallout. It tied into broader feelings about existing power dynamics.
So environmental concerns were deeply interwoven with social justice concerns.
Absolutely. Which connects to another major finding, this strong dislike for the idea of industrializing the oceans.
Industrializing the oceans. What do they mean by that?
Basically, the prospect of lots of new, large-scale infrastructure along the coast pipes, processing plants, whatever it might be. The worry wasn't just aesthetics, like it looks ugly. No, it was about potential impacts on culture, on tourism, on local economies like oyster farming, on those vital salmon runs. A real fear of transforming the coastline in a negative way.
I can see that. A coastline is more than just a view.
Exactly. And that led to a really strong preference for what they termed infrastructure-light approaches. Meaning, if we're going to do this, let's try to use infrastructure that's already there. Like, could we use existing wastewater outfalls? Or maybe modify ships that are already out on the water.
Piggybacking on existing systems.
Right. The thinking was partly about cost effectiveness, sure, but also about avoiding getting locked into massive new projects for a technology that might not pan out in the long run. It feels less risky, more adaptable.
Use what you have first. Seems sensible.
And maybe the most striking preference that emerged was about who should lead these projects. There was very strong opposition to the idea of corporations running OAE initiatives.
Really? Why such strong opposition?
Deep mistrust. The perception was pretty widespread that corporations prioritize profit above everything else, above the public good, community well-being, environmental protection. It connected to, frankly, bigger critiques of the whole economic system.
The profit motive clashing with environmental goals.
Yeah. And specific worries about OAE just becoming a tool for carbon offsetting, or worse, greenwashing. Especially, and this came up explicitly, if fossil fuel companies got involved.
Okay, so corporations are out. What about government?
Seen as better, maybe, but not ideal either. There were concerns about, how accessible government funding really is for local groups and how political winds can shift, changing priorities.
Right, government policies can change. So if not corporations and government isn't perfect, who do they want to see in charge?
Overwhelmingly, the preference was for OAE projects led by, and I'm quoting here, local community groups and sovereign nations' tribes.
Local communities and tribes?
Yes. The idea was that community ownership would mean real local participation, actual influence over decisions. And there was a particularly strong desire to see the tribes as leaders.
Why the tribes specifically?
People recognized their inherent sovereignty, their long history as stewards of the environment, and their, frankly, unique and deep knowledge of the local ecosystems. There is even mention of the Fish War documentary and the Bolt decision historical struggles that affirmed tribal rights and co-management as reasons to be optimistic about tribal leadership potential here.
Wow, that's a powerful connection to local history and rights.
It really is.
Yep.
But it's also important to say these views weren't always simple yes-no answers. There were real tensions people were grappling with.
Tensions? Like what?
Like the urgency. Everyone felt climate change is urgent, but how does that urgency balance against other goals, like protecting local environments or avoiding corporate control? Sometimes people felt maybe corporate involvement was a necessary evil if it meant faster action, even if they didn't like it.
A difficult trade-off.
Exactly. And scale was another tricky one. Large-scale OAE. On one hand, scary bigger potential for negative impacts, like bioaccumulation of substances in the food web. But on the other hand, maybe large scale is the only way it actually makes a dent in climate change. So it felt like a high-risk, high-reward situation to some.
A gamble in a way.
In a way, yes. And finally, where the impacts happen. People wrestled with things like, okay, maybe some localized harm, like from mining lithium for batteries or minerals for OAE, is acceptable if it helps the whole planet. Or shifting burdens, or we just moving environmental problems from the global north to the south. And even just near-shore versus offshore deployment. Near-shore has visual impacts, affects coastal industries, but offshore is harder to monitor. Lots of complex geographic trade-offs.
Definitely not straightforward. So pulling this all together, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive into community views on OAE?
Well, I think the clearest message is that people don't see OAE just as an environmental or technical issue. Their perceptions are deeply shaped by political factors, economic concerns, and fundamentally questions of environmental justice.
It's about power, profit, fairness, not just ocean chemistry.
Precisely. That really strong preference for community and tribal leadership, the push for using existing infrastructure, that deep skepticism towards corporate or fossil fuel involvement, it all points to that.
Yeah, those points came through loud and clear.
And importantly, these views aren't set in stone. They shift depending on how people weigh the urgency, the scale, the location of impacts. It's very context dependent. It's not a simple thumbs up or thumbs down on OAE itself.
Which really highlights how crucial the engagement process is, doesn't it? You need methods like these workshops and scenarios that let people explore these complexities, these trade-offs, and maybe even change their minds as they learn more.
Absolutely. It can't be a one-off tick-the-box consultation. It needs to be sustained, allow for real deliberation, maybe even require new kinds of institutions to support these conversations about OAE and other climate responses.
A lot to think about there. Okay, as we finish up, what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners mulling over?
I'd say really consider what these findings mean for the future. If communities are placing such a strong emphasis on local values, on justice, on who leads these projects, how do we actually build that into the governance and development of NCDR technologies going forward? How do we make sure local priorities aren't just an afterthought in these massive global efforts to tackle climate change? That, I think, is the critical question as OAE starts to move from concept to reality.